Welcome to the debate. So in 586 BCE, the God of the Israelites was, well, supposed to die.
Right. That was the unbreakable rule of the ancient Near East,
Exactly. I mean, when your temple is burned to the ground and your capital city is razed and your people are dragged off into exile and chains, your religion goes extinct. In the ancient world, your God's power was explicitly tied to your physical borders.
Because if the nation falls, the god dies, defeated by the conqueror's stronger deity.
Yes, exactly. But the Israelites did the unthinkable. They somehow decoupled God from geography. And today, we are asking how Yahweh survived.
And we are anchoring our discussion in Dr. Eric Forster's incredibly detailed text, Evolution of Judaism. Because, well, that survival wasn't a sudden miraculous flash of lightning. It was a deeply messy tectonic collision over centuries. We are looking at the profound historical transformation of Yahwism, how it evolved from a standard, local Canaanite cult where people worshipped multiple gods into the strict, tech-centric, exclusive monotheism that eventually became Judaism. The material forces us to confront a very specific, uncomfortable question. What was the primary driving force behind this monumental shift?
And that right there is the core of our disagreement today. I will be arguing that this incredible transformation was fundamentally a profound theological and prophetic response to sheer existential trauma, specifically the Assyrian threat and the Babylonian exile.
Right.
To survive psychologically and culturally, they had to radically redefine who God was.
And I will be taking the position that this theological evolution, as brilliant as the final product was, I'll admit, was primarily the ideological byproduct of a calculated socio-economic ambition by the royal and priestly elites in Jerusalem. They used the concept of one God to centralize wealth, consolidate power, and absolutely monopolize religious authority over the agrarian commoners.
Look, I don't deny that human institutions are always going to be political.
Sure.
But you cannot explain the survival of the Israelite identity through pure political cynicism. The trauma of the Babylonian exile forced a necessary, brilliant theological pivot. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, the Israelites lost everything.
They did.
No Davidic king on the throne, no land, no temple. They had to invent a completely new way to interact with the divine. The prophetic innovations we see during this period, like the declarations in Isaiah of, "I am the Lord and there is no other," it meant the religion had to become portable.
Right, because they were displaced.
Exactly. It became text-centric because the theological realization of a universal, singular God demanded it. The theology didn't just justify their survival, it was the engine of it.
I see the appeal of that narrative, but I think you're putting the cart before the horse here.
How so?
Well, the theology you are describing didn't just suddenly emerge in a vacuum during the exile. It was the culmination of a highly orchestrated process that started centuries earlier. To understand the shift, you really have to follow the money. Look at the Deuteronomic reforms of Kings Hezekiah and Josiah way before the Babylonians showed up. They issued sweeping royal decrees mandating that worship could only legally happen in the capital, in Jerusalem.
Right, to centralize the cult.
Yes, but they literally sent soldiers out to physically destroy local shrines, the rural altars known as the Bamot.
Which was a profound act of spiritual purification. They were removing the syncretic, Canaanite practices.
But it was the nationalization of a religious economy. Let's talk about the Maser, the mandatory 10% tithe of all agricultural produce.
Right, the tithe.
In an agrarian society, a 10% tithe isn't just dropping coins in a collection plate. It means massive carts of grain, vats of olive oil, vast herds of livestock.
Real physical wealth.
Exactly. Historically, in a decentralized system, that wealth stayed local. It supported local priests and village economies across the countryside. By centralizing worship, Josiah and Hezekiah forced all of that physical wealth to travel up the mountain directly into the Jerusalem temple.
I see where you're going with this.
They enriched a specific elite family of priests, the Zadokites, at the direct expense of the local rural Levites. The theology of one God, one temple was the ultimate socio-economic mechanism to monopolize national resources.
Well, I see the political angle, but I think you're ignoring the immense psychological terror of the historical moment those kings were living in. I challenge this tax grab narrative by offering an analogy.
Go ahead.
Think of what happens when you centralize resources in a besieged fortress. You don't do it to get rich, right? You do it so you don't all die.
Okay, but a fortress is temporary.
But look at the context. In 722 BCE, the entire northern kingdom of Israel was obliterated by the Assyrian Empire. It was wiped off the map, its people deported and lost to history. When King Hezekiah and later Josiah initiated these centralizing reforms, it was a desperate defensive measure.
A defensive measure?
Yes. The Assyrian army under Sennacherib was literally laying siege to Judean cities. We have the Lachish reliefs showing Judeans being impaled. To survive that kind of overwhelming military threat, they had to rally a deeply fragmented tribal people around a single unified identity, a single capital and a single deity.
A defensive measure by violently dismantling the altars of their own people? How does that unite a besieged country?
Well,
Just imagine you are a Judean farmer at this time. For generations, your family has prayed for rain and fertility at your local ancestral shrine. Suddenly, soldiers from the royal court in Jerusalem show up, smash your altar to pieces, and tell you that God only listens if you travel 50 miles to the capital city, dragging 10% of your harvest with you.
it's a dramatic shift, I admit.
You're not thinking about profound national unity. You're thinking you've just been robbed by your own king.
But it wasn't mindless violence against their own people, though. Even Dr. Forster's text points out the archaeological nuance here. Look at the fortress temple at Arad.
Right, the buried altars.
Exactly. When Josiah's forces dismantled it, they didn't just smash it to rubble and contempt. They carefully laid the altar stones on their sides and buried them beneath the floor.
True.
That demonstrates a deep reverence for the sacredness of those objects, even as the practice was being outlawed. They were transitioning the nation away from henotheism, the belief that many gods exist, but you only worship your national god, to monolatry, where Yahweh becomes the exclusive, unrivaled focus of the entire society.
But it was still forced from the top down.
It was born from existential necessity. The prophetic elite looked at the destruction of the North and concluded we are being punished by God for our divided loyalties. Centralizing worship was a profound national act of repentance.
Well, it was incredibly convenient timing for repentance, wouldn't you say?
What do you mean?
Consider how Josiah executed this. During routine temple renovations, the high priest conveniently discovers a lost scroll, the Book of the Law, what modern scholars recognize as an early version of the Book of Deuteronomy.
Yes, the Deuteronomic Code.
And wouldn't you know it, this newly discovered ancient text provided the exact ideological blueprint Josiah needed to justify destroying his political rivals. It gave him the divine mandate to march north, slaughter the priests of the rival cultic center at Bethel, and create a homogeneous, easily controlled society. It was aggressive nation-building masked as divine revelation.
But did it work as a political control mechanism? Because we know from the archaeological record that Josiah's reforms actually failed to eradicate popular polytheism.
Exactly. That proves my point. It was a top-down, elite mandate that completely ignored the lived realities of the common people.
Wait, let me finish the thought. It proves that state coercion isn't what ultimately created Judaism. The people were still engaging in the Canaanite matrix.
Right.
Dr. Forster highlights the thousands of Judean pillar figurines found in domestic homes from this pre-exilic period. Small clay statues of the goddess Asherah. The common people were still worshiping her for fertility and household protection, completely ignoring the strict monotheism of the Jerusalem elite.
Because the elite theology didn't serve them.
But my point is, state power couldn't force theology, which is why your theory hits a wall when we arrive at the ultimate crisis, the Babylonian exile in 586 BC.
How so?
Because the state completely collapsed. Nebuchadnezzar burned the temple to the ground. The royal family was blinded and dragged away. The elite Zadokite priests lost all their economic power. The Maser vanished instantly.
The physical collection stopped, yes.
If this entire religious project was just a political grift to centralize wealth, the religion should have died right there in the smoking ruins of Jerusalem. It should have vanished, just like the national religions of Ammon, Moab, and Edom did when their borders were erased.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't. Why? Because the theology outgrew the state.
I disagree. It didn't outgrow the state. The state's architects just adapted their survival strategy.
They completely reinvented the cosmos. I mean, the priestly source, this specific faction of displaced priests and scribes trying to make sense of the chaos in Babylon, sat down and codified texts like Genesis 1.
The creation narrative.
Think about the audacity of Genesis 1. You are sitting in chains, a prisoner of the Babylonian Empire, living in the shadow of their massive ziggurats. The Babylonians have a creation myth, the Enuma Elish.
Right, where Marduk builds the world.
Yes, where their chief god Marduk brutally rips the sea monster Tiamat in half to build the world out of her corpse. It's violent, it's chaotic, and it's intimately tied to state power.
Definitely.
And in the face of that, these exiled Judean priests write a story where Yahweh creates the entire universe simply by speaking. No battle, no rival gods, just supreme, calm sovereignty.
It's a striking contrast.
They declared that Yahweh wasn't defeated by Marduk. Yahweh was the only God of the cosmos, using Babylon as a mere instrument to punish Israel for its past idolatry. That is an act of sheer intellectual rebellion. That theological genius is what saved their identity.
I'm not denying the literary brilliance of Genesis 1. It is a masterpiece. But you have to ask yourself who was writing it and what their material interests were.
Well, the exiled priests.
Exactly. It wasn't the common, displaced Judean farmer who drafted that cosmic theology. It was the scribes and the priests, the Deuteronomists. Even in exile, without a nation, they needed to maintain their elite status and authority over their fellow captives. So they wrote a survival manual for their own social class.
They were writing a theodicy. They were trying to explain God's justice in the face of unimaginable collective suffering.
They were doing both, but the mechanics favored them. Look at how they explained that suffering. By rewriting the history of Israel to blame the exile entirely on the rural polytheism of the common people.
By condemning the high places.
Yes, they pointed to the many Yahwehs of regional shrines like Timon in Samaria and the household worship of Asherah and said this is why Jerusalem fell. They created a narrative of perfect legitimacy for themselves.
I think that's a very cynical read.
But look at the result. They essentially told the surviving population, we lost our land, our homes, and our freedom because you peasants didn't listen to us. And since they no longer had a physical temple to collect the Maser, these scribes did something brilliant. They turned the Torah itself into their new temple.
By making the religion portable.
By making themselves indispensable. Who could read the ancient Hebrew? Who had the education to interpret the complex new legal codes about ritual purity and dietary laws?
The scribes.
The scribes. They replaced the monopoly on animal sacrifice with a monopoly on literacy and legal interpretation. It was a brilliant adaptation to statelessness, yes, but it was fundamentally a tool of social control. It kept the displaced population dependent on the priestly class, even while subjugated in Babylon.
I just think that entirely strips the agency from the people who adopted these beliefs. You're treating the exiled Judeans as gullible victims of a scribal class, but that ignores the profound psychological shift documented in the prophetic literature of the time.
Go on.
Look at the prophet Ezekiel, writing right there in the midst of the exile. He explicitly shifts the theological burden from corporate guilt to individual responsibility. He famously writes, "The soul who sins shall die, and the son shall not bear the guilt of the father."
Which serves the elite by keeping the population rigidly obedient to the new moral codes.
No, it gives a traumatized people their agency back. Before Ezekiel, the prevailing thought was generational curses, that you were suffering in a foreign land simply because your great-grandfather worshipped at the wrong altar.
Right.
Ezekiel tells them, no, your personal daily actions matter to the creator of the universe. It meant their suffering wasn't just a pointless byproduct of historical politics. Their individual adherence to the Sabbath or dietary laws became a way to actively rebuild their relationship with God. That is an incredibly empowering, democratizing theological leap.
Empowering in theory, perhaps,
But let's look at how that theology was actually weaponized once they returned to Jerusalem.
Okay.
Because the exile ends, the Persians conquer Babylon, and their imperial policy allows the Jewish exiles to return and rebuild Yehud, their ancestral province. This brings us to the Ezraic restoration, around 458 BCE. Ezra arrives in Jerusalem.
The return of the exiles.
But he doesn't arrive as a humble spiritual teacher. He arrives with direct backing and funding from the Persian emperor. He is essentially an imperial official carrying the now codified Torah. And what is his first major act?
He seeks to establish a holy community dedicated to the newly codified law.
By engaging in extreme authoritarian boundary policing. I'm talking about Ezra chapter 10. Ezra discovers that the men who had been living in the land, the descendants of Israelites who were never exiled to Babylon in the first place, had intermarried with the surrounding populations.
Yes, the foreign wives.
His response isn't a spiritual awakening or a unifying sermon. He forces the harsh, mandatory divorce of all these foreign wives and the absolute expulsion of their children. He leads a public purging of the community.
It's a difficult text, undeniably. It was about preserving the fragile identity of a tiny returned minority against total assimilation.
It was about property consolidation. Divorcing foreign wives wasn't just about ritual purity. In an agrarian society, marriage means property rights, alliances, and inheritance.
So you're saying?
By forcing these divorces, Ezra's scribal class was consolidating land, wealth, and power strictly within the returned exile community, the Golah elite. They were cutting out the locals who had stayed behind and worked the land for 50 years. This was drawing a hard socioeconomic line between us and them. The scribes set themselves up as the absolute guardians of the law, using it to strictly enforce who got access to the community's resources. They replaced the fluid, syncretic Canaanite matrix with a rigidly policed religious state.
Well, if the goal was simply to establish an exclusive authoritarian scribal monopoly, why did Ezra do what he did in Nehemiah chapter 8?
The public reading?
Yes. I acknowledge the harshness of the segregation in Ezra 10, but you cannot look at that in a vacuum. You have to look at the Watergate Assembly. Ezra brings the scroll of the law out of the sanctuary into the public square and reads it aloud from morning until midday.
Okay.
And who is in the audience? The text specifically emphasizes men, women, and all who could understand.
Yes, he read them the legal code they were now forced to obey. Ignorance of the law was no longer an excuse.
He was democratizing the religion. For centuries, dating back to the Canaanite origins we discussed, the law, the myths, and the rituals were the exclusive secret domain of the priesthood. They were kept hidden behind the temple doors. The common people just brought the sheep and watched the smoke rise.
True.
But Ezra brings the text out into the light. He translates it. He explains it to the masses. He fulfills the ancient prophecy of Jeremiah, who envisioned a day when the law wouldn't just be inscribed on stone tablets, but internalized, written on the hearts of the people.
A beautiful metaphor, sure.
This public reading shifted the entire axis of the religion. It moved away from geographic, ritual animal sacrifice and toward ethical individual adherence. The text says the people wept when they heard it, and Ezra told them to wipe their tears and rejoice. This wasn't a cynical property grab. It was the birth of Judaism as a portable world religion, grounded in study, ethics, and a direct relationship with a universal God through a text that belonged to everyone.
I don't deny that it ultimately resulted in a portable world religion, but we cannot strip the historical romance away from how that portability was achieved and sustained.
What do you mean?
The democratization you speak of still required strict obedience to a priestly and scribal class that held the ultimate authority to interpret that text. And crucially, let's not forget what else was happening in Nehemiah. The physical temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt, and what resumed immediately?
The sacrifices.
And the wealth extraction of the Ma'azir. The physical tithes began flowing back into the storehouses controlled by the priests. The socioeconomic dynamics of religious centralization never went away. They just evolved.
Right.
The scribes simply layered an intellectual monopoly on top of the economic one. The transition from a vibrant, localized Canaanite pantheon to strict, centralized monotheism was undeniably driven by a constant institutional need to consolidate resources, control the agrarian population, and build a unified political entity capable of surviving as a vassal state under Persian imperial domination. To summarize my view anyway.
And I would summarize my position by saying that while politics, economics, and elite ambition undeniably played a role because, human beings are always going to build human institutions, those mechanics alone completely fail to explain the uniqueness of the Israelite survival.
Well, countless ancient nations centralized their wealth. Countless ancient nations had ambitious, greedy elites. Countless ancient nations were conquered and exiled. But only Israel survived the death of its state. They survived because of a profound theological reconceptualization. By elevating Yahweh from a localized southern warrior deity into El Elyon, the Most High, and eventually into the sole, universal, moral creator of the entire cosmos, they built a conceptual framework that could withstand the destruction of their physical world.
I think where we naturally converge and where Dr. Forster's text is most illuminating is on the understanding that this was a messy, deeply human process. The shift from a polytheistic landscape where Baal brought the rain and Asherah protected the home to a strict text-based monotheism was not a clean break.
No, not at all. It was a dynamic evolution shaped inextricably by both historical crises and incredible human adaptation.
Absolutely. We're looking at a centuries-long evolution. And to fully grasp it, you really have to look at religious history through both of these lenses. The theological leaps and the socioeconomic realities are just intertwined. There is so much more to explore in the material, especially regarding the raw archaeological evidence.
Oh, definitely.
Like we barely scratched the surface of the Kuntalit Ajud inscriptions, those 8th century pottery shards that explicitly bless people by Yahweh and his Asherah?
Yes.
It's just a fascinating window into the lost, diverse polytheism of the ancient world that existed right alongside the biblical narrative.
They really are incredible artifacts. They show us just how vastly different the lived reality of the ancient Judean farmers was from the final, polished theology crafted by the scribes that we have today.
So we will leave it to the listener to decide which force was truly in the driver's seat of this monumental transformation. When you look back at that great tectonic collision of ancient history, do you see a calculated elite maneuvering for political and economic control, or do you see a traumatized people reaching out to radically redefine the divine in the dark? We'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for listening.